The first person who handed me a sympathy envelope at my husband's funeral lowered her voice and said, "Don't worry, Helen. We'll all help you get through this." I thanked her politely and slipped the envelope into my purse. She meant well. At least, I think she did. What she didn't know was that by the end of that day, I would discover just how many people had already decided who I was without ever asking me a single question. I'm Helen Whitmore. I'm 71 years old, and on the day we buried my husband Charles after 46 years of marriage, I learned that grief was not the only thing waiting for me at the cemetery. The morning had begun with a gray sky hanging low over Hartford, Connecticut. A cool breeze moved through the rows of white folding chairs arranged beside the chapel. Friends, neighbors, former business associates, and distant relatives filled the space with hushed conversations and solemn expressions. Everywhere I looked, I saw people remembering Charles. He had been respected, admired, the kind of man who remembered birthdays, wrote thank-you notes, and never walked past someone who needed help. Losing him felt like losing the foundation beneath my feet. I stood near the entrance greeting guests as they arrived. Most offered kind words. Some hugged me. Others simply squeezed my hand. I appreciated every gesture. But as the service drew closer, something strange began to happen. People kept looking at me with the same expression. Not sympathy. Not exactly. It was pity. The kind reserved for someone everyone assumes has no future left. Then I noticed the table near the guest book. At first, I thought it was another flower arrangement. A small sign stood beside a decorative basket. I stepped closer. My stomach tightened the moment I read the words. Family Assistance Fund for Helen Whitmore. For a second, I honestly thought it was a misunderstanding. Maybe a church charity project. Maybe someone had placed the wrong sign. But then I saw the envelopes. Dozens of them. Guests were dropping money into the basket as they arrived. My fingers tightened around my purse strap. Charles had not even been buried yet, and someone had already convinced people I needed financial assistance. I looked across the room and found my daughter-in-law Vanessa standing near a group of relatives. Her black designer dress looked more expensive than my first car. She leaned toward an aunt and whispered something that made them both glance in my direction. When their eyes met mine, they quickly smiled. The kind of smile people use when they think they are being kind while discussing your misfortune. I walked over slowly. "Vanessa," I said gently, "what's the assistance fund?" Her eyes widened for a fraction of a second before she recovered. "Oh, Helen, everyone just wanted to help." "Help with what?" I asked. "Well," she lowered her voice. "After Charles passed, people were worried about your finances." I stared at her. Why would they be worried about my finances? She laughed softly. "You know how people talk. But people do not all invent the same story at the same time. Someone had planted that idea. Someone had told them I was struggling. Someone wanted me to appear helpless." Before I could respond, another guest approached carrying a white envelope. He pressed it into my hands and said, "Charles would have wanted us to look after you." I thanked him. Then another person did the same. And another. Every conversation sounded alike. Every expression carried the same assumption. By the time the service began, I realized this was not an accident. A narrative had been carefully built around me. Poor Helen. Lonely Helen. Financially desperate Helen. As I sat in the front row listening to the pastor speak about my husband's life, I could feel Vanessa watching me from several seats away, waiting for a reaction, waiting for embarrassment, waiting for gratitude. Instead, I folded my hands neatly in my lap and listened. Because while everyone else was focused on the story they believed, I was beginning to wonder who had written it. And more importantly, why. After the final guest left the cemetery, I rode home alone. The silence inside my Lincoln felt heavier than it ever had before. For 46 years, Charles had occupied the passenger seat beside me. Even when he was not physically there, I always felt his presence. That afternoon, however, another feeling sat beside me instead. Suspicion. By the time I pulled into the driveway, I had counted 23 sympathy envelopes. 23 people who believed I needed financial help. 23 people who had somehow heard the same story. I carried the envelopes inside and placed them on the kitchen table. The house felt enormous without Charles. Every room seemed to echo. His reading glasses still rested beside his favorite chair. A half-finished crossword puzzle remained folded on the end table. The grandfather clock in the hallway ticked steadily, indifferent to grief. I made myself a cup of tea and sat down. One by one, I opened the envelopes. Some contained $20. Others held $50. A few contained handwritten notes expressing concern about my future. Several mentioned worries about my financial situation directly. One note read, "Charles was always the provider. We know things must be difficult now." Another said, "Use this until everything gets sorted out." I stared at those words for a long time. Who had told them things were difficult? Charles and I had never discussed our finances with extended family. We had always kept those matters private. Even close friends knew very little. Yet somehow people were speaking as if my circumstances were common knowledge. Around 6 o'clock, my phone rang. It was my cousin Margaret from Ohio. We had not spoken in months. After offering condolences, she hesitated. "Helen, I hope you do not mind me asking," she said carefully. "Have you thought about downsizing yet?" I nearly dropped the phone. Downsizing. Well, Vanessa mentioned that maintaining such a large property might be impossible now. My grip tightened around the receiver. Did she? Margaret immediately sounded uncomfortable. Perhaps I should not have brought it up. "No," I said softly. "I am glad you did." After we ended the call, I sat motionless at the kitchen table. That was not an innocent misunderstanding. Vanessa was actively discussing my future with other people. My future, as if I were incapable of managing it myself. As evening settled over the neighborhood, more pieces began falling into place. During the reception after the service, I remembered overhearing fragments of conversation. Words I had ignored at the time because grief clouded everything. Poor Helen. I heard Charles left quite a mess. Vanessa is trying to help her. At the time, I had assumed they were speaking emotionally. Now I realized those comments shared the same source. Vanessa had been telling a story, a carefully crafted story, and everyone believed it. At 8 o'clock, Ethan called. My son sounded exhausted. "How are you holding up, Mom?" he asked. "I am managing." There was a pause. "Vanessa thinks you should not stay alone tonight." I looked around my kitchen. The home Charles and I had built together. The place where we raised Ethan. The place where every memory lived. "I will be fine," I replied. "You do not have to worry." Another pause followed. "If things become difficult financially, we can figure something out." My chest tightened. There it was again. The assumption. The certainty. Even my own son believed it. I ended the conversation politely and placed the phone face down on the table. Outside, darkness covered the yard. Inside, the grandfather clock continued its steady rhythm. Tick, tick, tick. For the first time that day, I stopped feeling hurt and started feeling curious. Because people do not suddenly invent the same false story unless someone gives it to them. And whoever started this rumor had a reason. I looked at the stack of envelopes one final time before placing them neatly back into the basket. Then I turned off the kitchen light and headed upstairs. Vanessa wanted everyone to see a helpless widow. What she did not realize was that the more she talked, the more questions she created. And questions have a way of leading people to the truth. The next morning, I woke before sunrise. For a few seconds, I forgot everything. Then I turned toward the empty side of the bed, and reality settled over the room again. Charles was gone. The funeral was over. And somewhere between those two facts, a strange story about my life had taken on a life of its own. I made coffee and carried a mug onto the back porch. The air was cool, and a thin layer of mist hovered over the lawn. Charles used to sit across from me every morning and read the newspaper while I worked on crossword puzzles. We rarely needed to fill the silence. After 46 years together, quiet had become its own language. Now the silence felt different. It felt like a warning. Around 9 o'clock, my phone rang again. This time it was Linda Parker, one of my oldest friends. We had known each other for more than 30 years. If anyone would speak honestly, it would be Linda. After a few minutes of conversation, she hesitated. "Helen, can I ask you something?" she said. "Of course. Are things really as bad as Vanessa says?" I stared through the kitchen window. What exactly has Vanessa been saying? Another pause followed. She told several people that Charles left behind significant debts. She said you were overwhelmed and too embarrassed to ask for help. For a moment, I simply listened to the sound of my own breathing. Significant debts. Overwhelmed. Embarrassed. Each word felt carefully chosen. Not dramatic enough to be questioned. Just believable enough to spread. "Did she say this recently?" I asked. "Several times over the past month," Linda admitted. "Most of us assumed she was helping you." After we ended the call, I sat motionless at the table. The past month. That detail stayed with me. Charles had only passed away a week earlier, which meant Vanessa had started building this narrative before his funeral. Before his death, She had already been preparing people to see me a certain way. My thoughts drifted back through recent months. Small moments I had ignored suddenly felt different. Vanessa asking unusual questions about household expenses. Vanessa commenting on retirement costs. Vanessa bringing up assisted living communities during family dinners. At the time, each comment seemed harmless. Together, they formed a pattern. Just after noon, Ethan stopped by the house. He looked exhausted. Grief had aged him in a matter of days. I hugged him tightly and invited him inside. We sat at the kitchen table where I had spent thousands of ordinary afternoons with my family. For a while we talked about Charles, his fishing trips, his terrible singing voice, the way he always burned pancakes on Sunday mornings. Then Ethan cleared his throat. Vanessa and I were talking, he began carefully. I nearly smiled. Somehow, every difficult conversation lately began with those same 4 words. About what? I asked. About making things easier for you. There it was again. Easier. Another word people use when they have already made decisions on your behalf. Ethan explained that Vanessa had found a few senior living communities nearby. Beautiful places, he assured me. Places with activities and maintenance services. Places where I would not have to worry about such a large home. I listened quietly until he finished. Then I asked a simple question. Did I tell anyone I wanted to leave this house? Ethan blinked. No. Did I tell anyone I could not manage it? No, he looked uncomfortable now. Confused. For the first time, I saw uncertainty in his eyes. Not because he had done anything malicious. Because he had accepted someone else's version of reality without examining it. After he left, I stood in the living room and looked around at the photographs lining the shelves. Birthdays, graduations, vacations, decades of memories captured inside simple frames. Someone was trying very hard to convince the world that I was fragile, dependent, and incapable. But the harder they pushed that image, the more determined I became to understand why. Because rumors are rarely about the person they target. More often, they reveal the intentions of the person spreading them. And I was beginning to suspect that Vanessa wanted far more than sympathy for a grieving widow. That evening, I found myself standing in Charles's study for the first time since the funeral. The room still smelled faintly of cedar and coffee. Sunlight filtered through the tall windows, casting long shadows across the hardwood floor. Everything remained exactly as he had left it. His leather chair sat behind the desk. A fountain pen rested beside a yellow legal pad covered with notes written in his familiar handwriting. For years, this room had been his sanctuary. Whenever life became complicated, Charles would sit here, think quietly, and somehow find clarity. I ran my fingers along the edge of the desk and felt an unexpected wave of memory. 6 months earlier, Charles had been sitting in that same chair when he looked up from a financial report and said something I barely noticed at the time. People change when they think the future belongs to them. I remembered laughing softly and asking what that meant. He had smiled and shaken his head. Nothing important, just an observation. Back then, I assumed he was talking about business. Now I was not so sure. Over the next hour, I found myself replaying dozens of conversations from the last few years. Little comments that once seemed harmless suddenly carried different meaning. Vanessa had always been charming in public. Friends often described her as thoughtful and attentive. Yet whenever family discussions involved property, investments, or long-term plans, she became unusually interested. She asked questions other people would never ask. She paid attention to details most people ignored. At Christmas dinners, she would casually bring up home values. During vacations, she would ask about insurance policies. At birthday parties, she somehow guided conversations toward retirement accounts and estate planning. None of it felt inappropriate on its own. Together, however, the pattern was difficult to ignore. I opened one of the desk drawers and found several old photo albums. Sitting on the floor, I began turning pages. There was Ethan at age 8 holding a fishing rod almost as tall as he was. There was our family standing in front of Yellowstone National Park during a summer road trip. There was Vanessa on the day she married Ethan. Looking at that photograph, I felt a surprising sadness. She looked genuinely happy. So did Ethan. Whatever had changed had happened gradually, one small step at a time. My attention shifted to a framed photograph sitting alone on a bookshelf. It showed Charles and me at our 40th wedding anniversary celebration. I remembered that evening clearly. Near the end of the party, after most guests had gone home, Charles had wrapped an arm around my shoulders and said, "Promise me something." "What?" I had asked, "If anything ever happens to me, do not let other people tell you who you are." At the time, I rolled my eyes and told him he was being dramatic. He laughed and kissed my forehead. But now those words echoed through the quiet room. Do not let other people tell you who you are. Somewhere over the past week, that was exactly what had been happening. Vanessa was telling people I was financially helpless. She was telling them I needed assistance. She was telling them I could not manage my own affairs. And the frightening part was not that she was saying it. The frightening part was how quickly everyone accepted it. As darkness settled outside, I carefully returned the photo albums to the shelf. Then I sat in Charles's chair and looked around the room. For the first time since the funeral, I felt something stronger than grief. Determination. Charles had spent a lifetime preparing for problems before they appeared. He noticed details. He anticipated consequences. And if I had learned anything from 46 years beside him, it was that important truths rarely reveal themselves all at once. They appear one piece at a time. Vanessa had already shown me enough to know there was a larger picture hidden beneath the surface. The question was no longer whether she was spreading false stories. The question was what she hoped to gain by doing it. The following afternoon, something happened that changed the direction of everything. I was sorting through condolence cards at the dining room table when the phone rang. The caller identification displayed a name I had not expected to see. Martin Cole, Charles's attorney. Martin had handled legal matters for our family for more than 20 years. He was meticulous, discreet, and not the type of man who called without a reason. "Helen," he said after I answered. "I hope I am not interrupting." "Not at all." His voice carried an unusual seriousness. "There are a few matters regarding Charles's estate that we should discuss in person." Estate. The word immediately caught my attention. During our marriage, Charles rarely talked about legal arrangements unless absolutely necessary. He preferred handling details quietly behind the scenes. "Is something wrong?" I asked. "No," Martin replied carefully. "In fact, I believe everything is exactly as Charles intended. But I think it would be best if we met tomorrow morning." After we ended the call, I sat quietly for several minutes. Something about the conversation felt significant. Not alarming. Significant. The next morning, I arrived at Martin's office shortly before 10 o'clock. His building stood in downtown Hartford, a few blocks from the old courthouse. Charles and I had visited many times over the years. Walking through those familiar doors without him felt strangely unnatural. Martin greeted me warmly and led me into a private conference room. After offering coffee, he closed the door and took a seat across from me. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then he folded his hands and smiled faintly. Charles always believed in preparation. I could not help smiling back. "That sounds like him." Martin nodded, especially when it came to protecting the people he loved. Something in his tone made me pay closer attention. He opened a file and carefully reviewed several documents before looking back up. "Before we discuss specifics, there is something important you should understand." Charles anticipated that certain assumptions might be made after his passing. I felt my pulse quicken. Assumptions. It was the same word that had been circling my thoughts all week. What kind of assumptions? Martin's expression remained calm. The kind people often make when they believe they understand someone else's finances. For several seconds, I simply stared at him. Then a memory surfaced. Charles sitting in his study. Charles warning me not to let others define who I was. Charles observing how people changed when they believed the future belonged to them. Suddenly those conversations no longer felt random. They felt deliberate. Martin slid a document across the table. I glanced down, but did not immediately focus on the numbers. Instead, I found myself thinking about Vanessa, about the rumors, about the pity, about the basket at the funeral. Martin allowed the silence to settle before speaking again. "Helen, your husband was an exceptionally careful man." I looked up. "I know. And because he was careful, there are facts that very few people currently understand." My eyes returned to the paperwork. For the first time, I realized there might be a reason Charles never seemed concerned when others discussed money around him. There might be a reason he appeared almost amused during certain family conversations. Martin continued explaining details, but one realization already stood above all the others. The story circulating through the family was completely false. Not partially false. Completely false. Someone had worked very hard to convince people I was vulnerable. Someone wanted others to believe I was dependent. Someone wanted me viewed as a burden rather than a decision maker. As I listened, a calm feeling settled over me. Not satisfaction. Not triumph. Clarity. Because for days I had been asking why Vanessa was spreading those rumors. Now I finally suspected the answer. If people believed I was weak, they would stop expecting me to have power. And when people stop expecting power, they stop paying attention to where it actually exists. When I returned home from Martin's office, I did not feel shocked. If anything, I felt strangely calm. For days, I had been searching for answers. Now I finally had enough pieces to understand the shape of the puzzle, even if I could not yet see the entire picture. Charles had prepared far more carefully than anyone realized. More importantly, he had anticipated exactly the kind of behavior I was beginning to witness. The temptation to confront Vanessa immediately crossed my mind. It lasted less than a minute. Charles had taught me something valuable over the years. People reveal more when they believe they are safe. The moment they realize they are being observed, they become cautious. So I decided to do nothing. At least, nothing visible. The following Sunday, Ethan and Vanessa invited me to dinner. Under normal circumstances, I might have declined. The past week had been exhausting, but I sensed an opportunity. If Vanessa truly believed her story was working, she would become more confident. Confidence often leads to mistakes. Their house sat 20 minutes away in a quiet suburban neighborhood. As I pulled into the driveway, I noticed a new luxury sport utility vehicle parked beside Ethan's truck. It was larger than the vehicle they owned 6 months earlier. Vanessa greeted me at the door with practiced warmth. She hugged me lightly and asked how I was doing. The question sounded caring. Her eyes were studying me for information. During dinner, the conversation remained pleasant at first. We discussed weather, neighborhood news, and a recent charity event. Then, almost casually, Vanessa shifted the topic. "Have you given any thought to the house?" she asked. I set down my fork. "What about it?" "It must feel overwhelming now," she said. "A place that size requires so much maintenance." Ethan nodded slowly. Not aggressively. Not suspiciously. Simply agreeing with the narrative he had been hearing for months. "I am managing fine," I replied. Vanessa smiled. "Of course you are. But eventually you might want something simpler. Something easier." There was that word again. Easier. I noticed she never asked what I wanted. She only suggested outcomes that benefited her preferred version of my future. A few minutes later, she mentioned a retirement community she had recently visited. According to her description, it sounded less like a recommendation and more like a sales presentation. Every detail seemed rehearsed. Every advantage carefully prepared. I listened politely and asked a few questions. The more I encouraged her to talk, the more enthusiastic she became. By dessert, she was practically planning my relocation for me. What fascinated me was not her confidence. It was her timing. She was discussing my future housing arrangements less than 2 weeks after Charles's funeral. Most people would still be offering condolences. Vanessa was already reorganizing my life. On the drive home, I replayed the evening in my mind. Not once had she asked about my emotional well-being. Not once had she asked what I needed. Every conversation centered on assets, responsibilities, expenses, or future arrangements. It was subtle enough to appear caring, but the pattern had become impossible to ignore. The next morning, another piece of information arrived unexpectedly. Linda called again. During a conversation with relatives, she had overheard someone mention that Vanessa was helping coordinate future property decisions for the family. Family property decisions. I nearly laughed when I heard the phrase. No one had asked for my input. No one had informed me of these discussions. Yet somehow plans were already being explored. After ending the call, I stood by the kitchen window and looked across the backyard Charles loved so much. The maple trees swayed gently in the afternoon breeze. Everything appeared peaceful, but beneath the surface, people were positioning themselves for a future they assumed they understood. What they did not realize was that the woman they believed to be vulnerable was quietly paying attention. And with every conversation, every rumor, and every well-rehearsed suggestion, they were revealing exactly who they were. 3 days later, I decided to stop waiting for information to come to me. Instead, I created an opportunity for people to reveal themselves. I called Ethan and invited him and Vanessa to dinner the following Saturday. Nothing elaborate, just family. Vanessa sounded pleasantly surprised when Ethan called back to accept. Her enthusiasm alone told me something. She believed everything was proceeding according to plan. Saturday arrived with clear skies and mild temperatures. By late afternoon, the house smelled of roasted chicken, fresh bread, and the apple pie Charles always loved. Preparing the meal brought back memories of simpler years, times when family gatherings felt genuine rather than strategic. For a brief moment, I allowed myself to miss those days. Then the doorbell rang. Vanessa arrived carrying a bouquet of flowers and a carefully rehearsed smile. Ethan followed behind her carrying a bottle of sparkling cider. We exchanged greetings and settled into the dining room. The conversation started comfortably enough. Work, neighborhood updates, a recent school fundraiser involving one of Vanessa's nieces. For nearly an hour, everything appeared normal. Then, exactly as I suspected, the conversation shifted. Vanessa glanced around the dining room and sighed softly. "This house really is beautiful," she said. "It must be difficult maintaining all of this by yourself." I smiled politely. "I have managed so far." "Of course," she replied quickly. "I just worry about you." There was that phrase again. "I worry about you." Over the past 2 weeks, I had heard it dozens of times. It always appeared immediately before someone suggested a decision on my behalf. Ethan nodded. "We just want to make sure you are not overwhelmed." I looked at both of them carefully. Neither appeared hostile. Neither appeared cruel. That was what made the situation so fascinating. People rarely see themselves as villains. They convince themselves they are helping. They create stories that justify their behavior. Vanessa continued speaking. "A friend of mine recently helped her mother transition into a smaller home. The process was actually very freeing." I took a sip of water and allowed a thoughtful expression to settle across my face. "Perhaps you are right," I said. The effect was immediate. Vanessa's eyes brightened. Ethan leaned forward slightly. For the first time all evening, genuine excitement entered the room. "Really?" Vanessa asked. "You have been thinking about it." "A little," I replied. "Managing everything alone does require consideration." The silence that followed lasted only a second, but it revealed more than an hour of conversation. Both of them had expected resistance. Agreement caught them off guard. Suddenly, Vanessa became more talkative than ever. She discussed property values, housing options, financial efficiency, maintenance costs, tax considerations. The more she spoke, the less cautious she became. What struck me most was how little attention she paid to my emotional attachment to the home. This was the house where Ethan learned to ride a bicycle. The house where Charles and I celebrated anniversaries. The house that held nearly 5 decades of memories. Yet in Vanessa's analysis, it existed primarily as an asset. Something to be optimized. Something to be managed. Something to be converted into a different form. By the time dessert arrived, I had learned far more than I expected. Not because Vanessa confessed anything directly, because she revealed priorities. And priorities often tell the truth more clearly than words. After they left, I cleaned the kitchen slowly. The house was quiet once again. I placed the final plate into the dishwasher and stood at the sink looking out into the darkness beyond the backyard. The evening had confirmed what I already suspected. Vanessa was no longer simply spreading rumors. She was preparing the ground beneath them, creating assumptions, guiding expectations, encouraging conclusions. And the most revealing part was that she believed I had accepted the role she created for me. A grieving widow, a dependent mother, a woman uncertain about her future. I turned off the kitchen light and smiled faintly to myself. Sometimes the easiest way to learn the truth is to let people believe their performance is working. And Vanessa was becoming very comfortable on the stage she had built. The following week, Martin contacted me again. His tone was calm, but there was purpose behind it. "I think it is time," he said. I knew exactly what he meant. For days, I had watched people make assumptions. I had listened to conversations that revealed priorities. I had allowed rumors to grow unchecked. Not because I was afraid to correct them, because every rumor exposed something useful. Now there was very little left to learn. Martin suggested a family meeting, a simple gathering to review several estate matters and answer questions. I agreed immediately. By Friday afternoon, everyone had accepted the invitation. Ethan, Vanessa, a few close relatives, even 2 family friends who had been particularly vocal about my supposed financial difficulties. The meeting was scheduled for the following Tuesday in Martin's conference room downtown. When the day arrived, I dressed simply. A navy blue blazer. Pearl earrings Charles had given me years earlier. Nothing extravagant. Nothing designed to make a statement. I arrived 10 minutes early. Martin greeted me warmly and guided me to a seat near the end of the long conference table. One by one, the others arrived. Vanessa entered with the confidence of someone who believed she already understood the outcome. Ethan looked slightly nervous but otherwise relaxed. Several relatives offered sympathetic smiles as they settled into their chairs. I recognized the expressions immediately, the same expressions I had seen at the funeral. Concern, pity, assumption. Once everyone was seated, Martin opened the meeting. He reviewed a few routine matters first. Insurance documents, property records, administrative details. Nothing unusual. Vanessa listened patiently, occasionally exchanging glances with Ethan. Then Martin closed one folder and opened another. The atmosphere shifted almost immediately. Before we continue, he said, there are several misconceptions that need to be clarified. The room grew quiet. Martin's voice remained steady. Over the past few weeks, various assumptions have circulated regarding Helen's financial circumstances. Nobody spoke. Nobody moved. Those assumptions are incorrect. I watched faces around the table carefully. Confusion appeared first, then uncertainty. Martin continued. Charles Whitmore established a comprehensive financial structure many years ago. The majority of his holdings were placed under arrangements specifically designed to provide long-term stability and control. Vanessa's posture changed almost imperceptibly. Her shoulders stiffened. Ethan leaned forward. Martin reviewed figures, documents, and legal provisions with professional precision. He explained how assets had been organized, how ownership had been structured, how authority had been assigned. Every sentence dismantled another assumption. Every page removed another layer of misunderstanding. Finally, he reached the conclusion. As of today, Martin said calmly, Helen remains the sole controlling authority over assets currently valued at approximately $28 million. Silence filled the room. Complete silence. Nobody reached for a glass of water. Nobody shuffled papers. Nobody even attempted a polite response. It was as though all sound had been removed from the building. I looked around the table. The sympathy was gone. The pity had vanished. In its place stood something far more revealing. Shock. Not because of the number itself. Because the story they believed had suddenly collapsed. Vanessa stared at the documents in front of her. For the first time since Charles passed away, she seemed completely unprepared. Ethan looked from Martin to me and back again, trying to reconcile two different versions of reality. Martin closed the folder and folded his hands. The meeting was not over. In many ways, it had only just begun. But one thing was already clear. The woman they believed needed rescuing had never needed rescuing at all. And the carefully constructed image they had built around me had just disappeared in front of everyone. No one spoke for several seconds after Martin finished. The silence felt heavier than any argument could have been. I sat quietly and watched the room absorb the truth. For weeks, people had looked at me with sympathy. They had discussed my future. They had offered advice I never requested. They had assumed weakness where none existed. Now they were being forced to confront a reality they had never bothered to investigate. Ethan was the first to speak. His voice sounded smaller than usual. Mom, why did you not tell us? I looked at him carefully. There was confusion in his eyes, but there was also embarrassment. Because nobody asked, I replied. The answer seemed to settle over the table like a weight. Nobody asked. It was true. Everyone had been so busy making assumptions that they never stopped to have a real conversation. Vanessa remained unusually quiet. Throughout our entire relationship, silence had never been her strongest skill. Yet now she seemed unable to find the right words. I almost felt sorry for her. Almost. Martin continued reviewing documents, but the energy in the room had completely changed. Every comment was measured. Every question was cautious. The confidence that had filled so many conversations over the previous weeks had vanished. When the meeting finally ended, people gathered their belongings slowly. Several relatives approached me to apologize. Some admitted they had believed rumors they should have questioned. Others confessed they had assumed the assistance fund at the funeral had been organized with my knowledge. I accepted their apologies politely. Holding anger would not improve anything. The truth had already done its work. As everyone began leaving, Vanessa approached me. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then she offered a careful smile. I was only trying to help, she said softly. I studied her face. Perhaps part of her believed that statement. Perhaps she had convinced herself that controlling situations was the same thing as helping people. Helping starts with listening, I replied, not assuming. She lowered her eyes and nodded. Whether she understood the lesson, I could not say. Some lessons arrived too late. Outside, the afternoon sun reflected against the office windows. I stood beside my car for a moment before driving home. For the first time since Charles passed away, I felt something close to peace. Not because of the money. The number itself meant very little compared to what I had learned. Money had simply revealed character. It had exposed priorities. It had shown me who respected me and who only respected what they imagined I possessed. That evening, I returned to the house and walked through each room slowly. The photographs on the shelves looked the same. The furniture remained exactly where it had always been. Yet everything felt different. Not because the house had changed. Because I had changed. Grief still existed. I still missed Charles every hour of every day. But alongside that grief stood clarity. I finally understood what he had tried to teach me all those years. People reveal themselves when they believe they have something to gain. And they reveal even more when those expectations disappear. A week later, I met with Martin again. Together, we reviewed several updates to my estate plans. Some beneficiaries remained exactly the same. Others did not. Every decision reflected what I had learned, not what I had lost. As I signed the final document, I thought about the basket at the funeral, the envelopes, the whispers, the pitying smiles. Those moments had hurt at the time. Yet without them, I might never have seen the truth so clearly. That evening, I sat on the back porch as the sun disappeared behind the trees. The air was cool. The sky glowed gold and orange. For a moment, I could almost hear Charles laughing beside me. He had been right. The future did belong to someone. It belonged to the person wise enough to see the truth when everyone else was distracted by appearances. And in the end, the richest thing Charles left me was not wealth. It was the ability to recognize exactly who my family really was.